Hey friends, Daniela here, and this is an episode that you are going to want to download because you'll probably have to listen to it twice. Now, I'm doing an insurance deep dive with one of our Growth Factor members, Andy, who also happens to be an insurance agent. Now, Andy and his wife, Christine, joined the program after they had purchased a spa that they have grown to something like 400 members. Absolutely incredible. And Andy's always chiming in with such valuable information. Even I'm learning a ton from him. So it was one day that we were on a laser coaching call, and he had given this incredibly thoughtful, incredibly thorough answer. And after we got off the call, I messaged him on Instagram and I was like, do you want to be on the podcast? He said yes. He said, of course. Let me put together a document that I can share with the audience. And oh my goodness, this thing is detailed. In fact, in the interview, we only got through half of it. So I want to make sure that you download the PDF that goes with this episode. So insurance is one of those things like systems. It's sort of boring and not something that you really want to deal with until you realize the freedom that it gives you. So if you're looking to build a company, not just create a job for yourself, this is the kind of stuff you've got to be clear on. You've got to understand. You got to make sure that you have in place for that company. So huge shout out to Andy for sharing his expertise with our community. Let's go ahead and play that interview. All right, Andy, welcome to the Spa Marketing Made Easy podcast. So excited to have you here to talk about insurance today. I know it sounds like one of those topics that's like, oh, this is going to be a great episode, but it actually, like, I'm looking at this document you put together and I'm like, this is going to be a great episode. Definitely helping a lot of people in our community.
That's the goal, is to provide value. And absolutely. But yeah, insurance is normally a boring topic, but I've somehow
not
ended
until like when it comes to save the day, it's like the most important thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it can be a make or break for a business, and a business or home or anything. I mean, it's such a huge part of your life that if you understand insurance and like kind of risk management in general, like there's a lot of business practices that you can do too to help mitigate, not having to buy as much insurance because you've mitigated the risks yourself. It's an important field. It's not going away. It's only getting more complicated. We're actually in a hard market with insurance right now, which means, carriers that were saying yes to things 3 to 5 years ago, things are getting a lot harder to place. Like State Farm lost, I think, $70 billion last year. So they're being a little more careful on what they say yes to.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let's just, this is a question that a lot of, like, in the spa industry, people will start out oftentimes as solos. They'll kind of grow their business. They'll hire. I know you and your wife bought an already established business, which is, also a route that a lot of people go, but making sure that like you protect yourself from a very big purchase, a very big investment, which in both cases, whether you're buying a business or growing it and bringing on employees, there are things that can knock you to your knees, especially if you get into medical and things like that. So I wanted to kind of go over, I'm going to look at your headlines here that you put on this document and really do the kind of high level overview of insurance in general. So let's just start with like, what are the types of carriers? So what does that mean?
Yeah. So types of carriers, to me, there's kind of two buckets of carriers I think of. There's standard carriers so I'm an independent agent, a local independent agent. We're the biggest agency in our county, but far from the biggest agency in Michigan or the US. We represent 8 standard carriers, and then I have access to thousands of carriers in the E&S or excess and surplus lines. Most of your standard carriers are going to cover, anything up to a med spa. So like your normal things done in a normal non-medical spa. My wife and I, we do massage, facials, that type of thing. We are started doing lashes. That's all covered under a company called West Bend. They are a local company based out of Wisconsin. There's a marketing rep that stops in once a month. And if there's a problem with coverage or there's a question, I have an underwriter on speed dial. I have a marketing rep that if a claim goes bad, there are local claim reps in our area for this company. So it's just, for me, like, I really like writing coverage with that where I feel like as an agent, I have a little more control, and I can get involved if things happen, and I have more people I can reach out to for answers. Whereas when we get into the E&S or excess and surplus lines, a lot of these carriers are big conglomerate companies. They're Lloyd's of London, PBIB, carriers that you probably have never heard of on TV. I don't have access to marketing reps. I don't have access, and everything's a 1-800 number or a screen to fill out on a web-based form. The amount of local, support is not there. And I kind of consider it similar to like picking you want a skincare line that has local reps that can come to your events and help out and is available to answer questions or, provide support, or you're going to go with a very popular, maybe, nationwide skincare line. You got to kind of look at what you want out of a carrier. I really like that local feel, but maybe sometimes the big national carrier makes a little more sense.
I never thought of it in that way, because when you're looking at kind of your internal board of advisors, it's like your financial advisor, your attorney, your CPA. There's these people that are very involved in both my personal life and my business life. I never thought of including the insurance agent in there, but it sounds like that's definitely a part of the process. And in fact, when my husband and I were doing, when we brought on a financial advisor and started doing estate planning and whatnot, the first thing that he said to us is, you're underinsured. And we had to go and get, our life insurance, all set up in the proper way.
It's interesting as an agent. I've been in insurance for 12 years and I've been an agent for 4. So I started on the carrier side, actually being an underwriter. So my job before my current position is to tell agents what to do, actually to set the policy forms and whatnot. So I know the back end of insurance very well. And now I'm selling and advising. And when you get into a business as an insurance agent, you really, to do a good job, you have to understand everything about their business. It's very in depth, or it should be, at least. There's a lot of people that a lot of people and carriers and whatnot that aren't thorough. But yeah, it should be it doesn't have to be hard, but it should be thorough. So. Yeah.
So let's talk about the different types of policies that, let's just say, like the average spa, whether, up to that medical spa level. What are we looking at in policies that are recommended, or, that are, because I hear a lot of times we'll see when someone hires a provider, they're like, well, they have their own professional liability, or they'll have, how are we figuring out who should have what and how much those numbers should be?
Yep. So I guess let's kind of start at the beginning, right? You graduate from school, you have your license, you're renting a room, or you go to work for someone and they ask you to carry the insurance. As much as I would love to provide that, most of the time it makes sense to get a policy through, like, a lot of the accrediting programs have partnerships with insurance companies that they're the big conglomerate insurance companies that provide you general liability and a professional liability policy, and it's usually really cheap. I mean, it's like $300 a year, I think, is what I've seen is the average for 2 million per occurrence and 4 million aggregate, which means per time something happens, and then the amount of times per year something happens. That's usually done on what's called a business owner's policy. It may not have that in that type of form, but that's kind of the lingo, is a BOP or business owner's policy. As you move into your own business and maybe have some employees, or you're renting a space and doing chair rental or room rental, you might get a TPP or a tailored protection policy. And both of those are just groups. It's a group of, it's a policy with a bunch of sub policies under it. The biggest one is general liability, and professional liability for spa owners. But then there's property coverage, business personal property, betterments. I can kind of go into that later, but I kind of want to hit on the top thing. So you'll have a business owner's policy, or TPP, or tailored protection policy. You'll want some type of commercial auto policy, actually, if you're driving around or if employees or whatnot are running errands. Workers' compensation is, coverage for if your employees get hurt. And then umbrella coverage is coverage if you need more liability, higher limits than what's on the base form of the forms we've just talked about. And then you've got some specialized policies and coverages like cyber liability, employer liability, and sexual molestation. I hate saying that word, but we're in that world today. So,
well, and I guess, would that be considered like in somewhere that offers massage? Like, I've actually been assaulted before in a massage, and I had to go and, report that and all of that stuff. And I'm like, look, I'm in the industry. I know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So would that be considered, like if I were to sue that location, which I didn't, but if I were to sue that location and they had a sexual molestation, is that considered that, or is that like an assault or something? How would something like that work?
So you have the policy form. What a lot of spas do is the carrier, or the provider, will have the coverage for professional liability and general liability. A lot of times sexual molestation is not covered in that. And it's a specialty coverage that you're only going to get in a spa specific carrier. So typically, if you just have a carrier that only has general liability, that's not covered.
So if you have a therapist that crosses a line that's sexual, that would be considered, yep. That would fall under that.
Yep. Yeah. It's a very specialized coverage. It's typically not covered in most standard policies. And it's typically excluded in most standard policies, and then you can buy it back in a spa package for an additional premium. And yeah, I think it's extremely important for both the therapist to have, if they're the one providing the insurance, and the spa owner. We carry a lot of coverage. Our spa's in Okemos, Michigan, which is right down the street from East Lansing, where the Me Too movement started. I'm personal friends with several of the survivors and the attorney that handled the case. I want all the coverage I can get for that. We try to take care of any issue. We've thankfully never had an issue, and I hope to never have an issue. Mm-hmm. And that's where that risk mitigation comes in, is, think about how your spa is designed. Are there things you can do to help with that issues? Are you in a closed room, where it's all soundproofed and whatnot? Is there something that you can do to make the client feel safer in that environment while still maintaining their respect and whatnot, and privacy? So, that kind of stuff is,
It's
a touchy
unfortunate,
subject.
but it's the reality is, it does happen from time to time. And I'm sure that there's somebody that, like a lot of people don't know that happened to me. And that was a very traumatizing thing. And it was only like 6 years ago. It's a shame for males in our industry though, because there are a lot of really great males that care about the profession, that are, you know, love the profession and want to do good work. And I will never go to another male therapist again. And that's just a built-in, like, I'm never putting myself in that situation because it was a male therapist that I had the concern with, the assault. And I never thought, like, for me being in the industry, I was so much like, oh no, it's, when as someone who was a practicing esthetician for so many years, when you're dealing with, doing Brazilians or doing areas like that, it's like, you just look at it like an elbow. You just look at it like it's because it's such a normal, you're looking at it from a medical standpoint. So for me, I took that approach and was like, I don't have a problem going to a guy because this will be how they will approach it. And it's the one person, that really causes that problem for so many others. So that's
Yeah,
unfortunate.
it is. We have some amazing male therapists at our spa, and yeah, I mean, their booking percentages aren't as good as on average as the females, and I'd love it to be different, but it's not. So I
Yep.
love how I have put that last on my list, and we went right there first.
I know.
Get it out of the way. Rip the Band-Aid off.
Get it out of the way. All right. Well, let's move on to workers' compensation. So
Yeah.
how are we, this is if your employees get hurt on the job, like talk to me about, is this something that everybody's having? Is this not covered in business liability? Because business liability and professional liability, that's like if a patient falls down in your practice, right? But workman's comp is if a worker falls down or something.
Yep. So workers' comp is typically always a separate policy. So you've got that business owner's policy and TPP that covers your professional and general liability. This is a separate policy. And it covers your employees if they get hurt on the job. That's as simple as it is. In the spa industry, there's a lot of misclassification of employees versus contractors. And at the end of the day, you have to think about your business and go, if I have an employee or if I have someone that works for me that gets hurt on the job, is my business going to get brought into a lawsuit? Do you have a 1099 contractor? Or if the hospital and their attorneys do an investigation and they determine that person was an employee, is your business going to get brought into it? That's something that you should think about because workers' compensation insurance is not expensive.
So if you go to irs.gov, they have a great page that talks about the difference between employees and contractors. And it's not just if you designate that, it's the IRS will look at, are you telling them, are you giving them direction in how to perform the service? Are you giving them direction in time to be there? There's all these classifications that 99% of the time, if you have a spa, you will have an employee. And that's just the way it has to be, unless you're doing purely room rental where they're operating their own business out of your room. But you have to be even careful with that because then they can set their own hours. They can set their own, it has to be looked at as a completely separate business. But 99% of the time, employees are the way to go.
Yep. And I mean, again, it's not expensive. I mean, we have between 12 and 15 employees varying, and our workers' compensation coverage is less than $1,000 a year. So, it's not expensive. So if you're on the fence, even if you still 1099 your people, if you're on the fence, I would buy the coverage. And you can classify people as 1099 versus W-2 too within your workers' compensation, and you'll get a better rate if you list them as 1099. So,
okay, commercial auto. So this is what counts as a commercial vehicle? Do you have to have, it's not like your personal car that you use for work. It's like a car like that would be the car owned by the spa that's used for spa things, right?
Yep. So like if you have, like I've seen mobile barber, I've not seen a mobile esthetician or massage therapist, but like let's say you had a mobile massage or esthetician, um, you know, where you had a van or a pulled a trailer or something like that. If you have a vehicle where employees or the vehicle's all lettered up, the vehicle's owned by the business, you absolutely need a commercial auto policy.
And is this
It,
separate than your insurance, like your vehicle insurance that you get, you know?
yep. So a personal auto policy and a commercial auto policy are two very different things. Like for example, like I mentioned the trailer, but in Michigan, at least in Florida, I'd have to check that. But the liability, like if you're pulling a trailer for on your personal auto, the liability is covered on the trailer if you're pulling it personally. Like if I hook up my travel trailer and go up north. Whereas in a business, I actually have to list that trailer and list the liability for it. So, commercial and auto insurance is very, very different from personal auto insurance. So the line I would draw is, if you have a vehicle that's all lettered up that you're driving around to events and whatnot, it's titled to the company, that should probably go commercial. Also, carriers have different limits. Like I know Progressive has a 800-pound, I believe it is, limit for like if you have a personal auto policy, but you're like a contractor or you have a bunch of stuff in the back of your truck, anything over 800 pounds, they actually could deny a claim on it. And you're using that vehicle for business, they could deny that claim, saying that, that vehicle is used for business.
Wow.
Yeah. The other side of commercial auto and what's going to be most common for spa owners is a coverage called hired and non-owned auto. And you can typically get this on your business owner's policy or TPP. So what that does is it covers your spa for incidental business use. So like if our spa manager runs to the bank to get change or runs an errand for the business, I'm not going to monitor what kind of liability limits that person has. But if she's got a stack of paperwork or, stuff for our business, that coverage could, our business could get brought into a lawsuit. And, if we don't have this coverage, we have no auto coverage. Let's say they hit someone walking or riding a bike, that situation could be pretty terrible for our business. And this is I think on our policy, it's less than $200 a year for this coverage.
Wow.
And, it's not expensive, but it's very important. So.
All right. So let's move into this BOP or TPP. You're going to see the following coverages. So general liability, business income, et cetera.
Yep. So general liability is going to cover your trip and falls. That's someone falls in the wintertime on ice or whatnot. Business income is very important. It typically comes as a package, but just make sure you have it. If your business sustains a loss, like a fire, flood, it has to be a covered loss. But if your business sustains a loss, it will help you pay the bills that don't stop. Your landlord probably going to keep charging your rent. Your insurance bill is still going to be due. You're still going to have to pay, your taxes, all that kind of stuff. And business income helps with that. Equipment breakdown coverage is another item that one's usually optional. And that's going to be coverage for items that break. There's going to be specific perils for that. Perils are like what happens, right? But like think of how expensive aesthetic equipment can get. That's a coverage that if you have, like our spa, we don't have, the most expensive thing we have is a sauna. It's maybe $4,000 sauna. I'm not really that worried about it. But I know that there can be some equipment that's 20, 50,
But when
plus
you get
thousand.
into light and laser devices too, and those typically have their own warranties and things that you're paying for, but those can be 200,000, depending on
But
the
still,
device.
if you have a lightning strike or something like that and it takes out that laser device, you probably want that coverage.
Yes. It's like a mini mortgage.
Exactly. Actually, that's more than my mortgage.
In Michigan.
Yeah. Then we get into professional liability. It's also called errors and omissions. We can lump the med spa coverage in with that. The medical malpractice in with that. Medical malpractice is really just it's professional liability or errors and omissions coverage, and it's at a higher level than what massage therapist or an esthetician would have. It's medical grade, if you will.
So how would you look at
one thing?
Tell me how you would look at, like, because we have a lot of med spa owners that are non-physician owned. So if you have a medical director, are you on the medical director's professional liability? Typically you are under them, but is your business also insuring them? Like who needs to have what policy? If you have a medical director that's typically IC, or if you have like an MSO, how did those all piece together?
So each state is very different with this. At the end of the day, you need to make sure each business entity is protected, right? So like in Michigan, I can't own a med spa because I am not a physician. So if I were to partner with one, and it's going to become carrier specific too. Each carrier is going to do this differently. So I could have one carrier cover every entity, the MCO, my S corp, and the physicians doing the work. The MCO may have their own policy, and if that's the case, I would want to be listed, or I would want to make sure my S corp is listed as additional insured on their policy. So if they cancel the policy, I would know about it because I would want to make sure they have coverage. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, we just need to make sure that each liability or each entity is protected. And if it's not protected under one policy, there's ways to set yourself up to make sure you get automatic notifications if the other person doesn't, decides to cancel their policy. We'll pick on contractors. A lot of contractors will write insurance policies for a job and then cancel it. Like there's a house down the street from my parents, the tree guy came in, said he had coverage, didn't, tree fell on his house, and it's been an absolute mess for the insurance company to work with the tree company because they're trying to subrogate, which means go after the tree company for the damage, but he doesn't have any insurance, even though he provided a proof of insurance to the homeowner.
So he had it and then canceled that, and the homeowner didn't know that it was canceled.
Yep. So if you are listed as additional insured on their policy, that would prove that they have coverage, and you get notification of that. So if I handle all the insurance for our employees, and all of our providers are employees, so I don't have to worry about that. Again, that's another risk mitigation thing that we do. It wasn't that much extra for us to do it that way. It's nice that our employees don't have to worry about insurance as long as they're working for us. And I know that they're covered. Mm-hmm. If you are having them purchase their own coverage, I would want to be, if I was a business owner, I would want to be listed as additional insured on their policy. That way I get automatic notification if it's been canceled or whatnot. That's one way to protect yourself, if you will.
I didn't even think about that, but that's such a great point.
Yeah, because otherwise, what are you doing? Setting a calendar reminder to make sure that they have their, that they give you a proof of insurance, and then what's stopping them from paying the minimum premium, which is usually 25%, and then canceling the policy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's yeah, and especially with like, we just brought on lashes. Can you imagine not having insurance on that? Like,
And having
you
something
get really
happen
close to
in
someone's
the eye.
eye. You know?
So you have on here, this, we kind of touch on this employees versus contractors and the professional liability. And then you're talking about a couple of questions to ask yourself to determine negligence. Um,
Yep.
let's get into that, because I think that kind of goes into this conversation, this topic that we're talking about really well right here.
Yeah. So like we said before, like we talked about before, your providers can get a policy for professional and general liability very inexpensive. It's going to be less expensive than what you can do it for. But let's say something happens, they're going to be brought into this lawsuit. Now they have insurance coverage. Is that going to be enough? Hopefully, probably. But also, your spa is going to be responsible. I mean, it's likely going to be responsible.
So if they were providing a service in your location, your spa could be sued as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because ultimately you're offering that service. Yeah.
Yep. And are they paying the provider, or are they paying the spa? That's another question to ask yourself. They're going to go after the entity that the customer went to, typically not necessarily the provider. Mm-hmm. So like some questions to ask yourself if you have 1099 contractors is, who does the customer pay? Do they pay the business or the provider? Are there rules and guidelines that the spa has set in place to follow when doing services? Like, I know our providers would love to do a 75-minute facial. We tell people it needs to be 60 minutes, 60 or 90. There's not a take your time policy. Mm-hmm. And we follow our skincare company's recommendations on the different steps and treatment. So like, the spa owners have set that precedent in place, and if that's the case, if a lawsuit happens, you're probably going to get brought into it. And then the third question is too, most employees or subcontractors don't have like cash reserves to make sure they stay in business after a couple slow months. So that's what I always look at too. Now I'm very risk adverse, but at the same time, like, if an attorney gets involved, they're going to follow the money. Insurance is typically there to stop that, but typically spa owners are the ones that are responsible and have the reserves, and they're going to be the easier target to go after. Mm-hmm. But so like, there's a lot of spas that I see that don't carry professional liability. I strongly recommend getting professional liability to cover the entire spa, even if your providers have it. If your providers have it, you could actually potentially get a discount on your policy with that, but still have it as a general for your spa. So I would definitely recommend that. And I personally think you're crazy if you don't, but it doesn't affect my life. So
this next one here, product liability. So that's really interesting. Most policies include coverage for other brands' retail products. If you're white labeling or private labeling a product, it becomes your product. So make sure your carrier knows this and has proper liability class codes for this. Talk to me more about that.
Yeah. So, if you're white labeling something, it becomes it's a business of yours. It's your product. You're putting your name on the line and selling it to your customers as maybe you had it made, but it's your business. So you need to make sure you're covered for this.
If somebody has a reaction or something like that, in general, if you're working with a company, like a particular brand, mm-hmm. You fill out a report, you send it to the brand, and you say, so-and-so had, this patient of mine had a reaction. But if I am carrying, the Daniela Warner skincare line that I private labeled from one of these companies, the Daniela Warner skincare line is going to be liable, not whatever the private label brand is. Is that correct?
I mean, both could be brought into it, right? It's the same conversation that we had before with a provider versus the spa. But, Daniela Warner's skincare line, do they have insurance? That's going to be a question. Is it covered under your spa policy? Because, the Massage Bliss facial line, I don't have coverage for it on my policy, and I don't white label because of that. And you see a lot in other industries, at least. I don't know the skincare industry as well as I should, but I see a lot of other industries. People say that, and actually carriers allow it. If you're white labeling for people, I can just add you to my insurance. Well, then you're really creating a business relationship between your white label company and them to turn the claim. So
can you say that part again? That just cut out. So then if they add you to their insurance, you're creating a business.
You're creating a business relationship. So let's say you have, you label relationship with a ABC company. They say, we'll just add you to our liability, and you could be added as additional insured, same as what we talked about before. But then if you do that, you're relying on them to turn the claim in. I don't know, you have to read that policy to see if you actually have any rights to turn a claim in under their policy, because you don't own any of the entities that they own. They control the policy. You may be listed on it to cover yourself, but you have to rely on them to turn a claim in. And if it's a big company, are they going to? You have to trust that, right? So it's a little bit of a tricky situation that I would, you have to look at it from a risk mitigation perspective. Is the juice worth the squeeze for that extra markup? Can you get it covered properly or not? Along with product coverage too is product recall coverage. So, let's say you white label with a bunch of bath bombs or soaps or something like that. If they come back and all of the soaps just like melt at room temperature and you have to recall 5,000 soaps, that's typically not covered under product liability. That's a separate coverage called product recall coverage. So like if you break out, right, that would be, if you have a reaction, liability is going to cover that. But then if 100 people have that same reaction and you have to recall that entire product, that's called product recall coverage. It's a completely different product, and you're really getting into like manufacturers type insurance, not like spa type insurance with that. So just something to keep in mind. I love the idea of like building this brand around your spa, but you also kind of have to keep in mind of your liability with that. Yep.
So we have a bunch more on this document because you are very detailed, which I love. But we're going to kind of clean this up and get it where we can share this with our listeners. Is that right? This document?
Yep. I have to do that.
Okay, perfect. So let's.
One thing with the liability.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'll say one thing with the liability too, and I think really the most important to talk about versus all the other stuff on here, maybe is your class codes, right? So like liability class codes. So the spa world has far exceeded the insurance world as far as like what's being done versus what a bunch of old guys in suits in ivory towers are talking about with insurance. So like, so we do massage and facials, and we have a few different types of facials. And then we just started bringing on lashes. So like on our policy on page 125 of 280 is our page that lists out all of the stuff that we do, right? Massage is pretty easy to understand. We have this, we have 5 part-time therapists and 3 full-time therapists. We have 2 full-time estheticians. And now we brought on lashes. So like me understanding insurance, I either have to like read through that entire policy or I have to check with my underwriter to make sure that
as an insurance agent.
Yeah. So like anything you do, what I would recommend for anyone that owns your spa is to, I think it's good to email your agent and say, hey, this is the services we offer. I need to make sure that they're listed under the class code that you have me rated for, because that's what determines your pricing for insurance, but it also determines to the insurance company, like what they're paying for, right? So if I don't have lashes listed on my policy and I bring that service on and something happens and it's not listed at all, they could actually deny that claim because they had absolutely no idea that it was happening.
Wow.
You can't assume that, oh, I'm a spa, I do these services, this is just all covered in my spa insurance. Typically,
so that insurance agent really does need to be in your circle of advisors.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. And it shouldn't be complicated, right? It's just go to your website, copy paste all of the services you have offer, email it to your insurance, and just make sure that those services are listed under the class code that is provided on your policy, because it's not gonna exactly link up, right? Like our class code says like beauty on it. Well, what does beauty stand for? What does beauty mean? Well, there's on pages 175 through 200 that information and exclusions and all that kind of stuff is listed, but none of us are ever going to read that. We just need to see we just need to make sure it's listed properly.
So we're going to include this you guys, we're only like halfway through this document, just to give you an idea of how much information is out there. So if you have your own spa, if you have your own practice, you definitely want to check this out. Andy, I know that I know you're doing this out of the goodness of your heart, and you're licensed in Michigan, right?
Yep. Michigan's our primary, basically any state that touches Michigan and Florida.
Okay.
They're licensed in. So
if people wanted to work with you, they can reach out to you if they're in those states. If they're not in those states, how would they find an insurance agent? Like, where would be the first place to look to find somebody that they can have a relationship with, like you're talking about?
Yep. I'm a big fan. I'm an independent agent myself. I'm a big fan of the independent agency system. I think you can get the most, they have access to more carriers than captive agents like State Farm or Allstate. Now, that being said, some of those captive carriers might have great plans. So if you find someone that you really trust with that, by all means, go for it. As far as a nationwide thing, just Google search independent agency in my town. There is, like him or not, Dave Ramsey does have a endorsed local provider network. He's the only person I know of that actually, I don't know what his process is, but he does vet insurance agents. He works with independent agents only. So at least I believe that. At least that was a while ago. So you might search on his website to find a good local independent agent in your area. So that would be my advice if you're not in any of the states that I'm currently active in.
Perfect. Well, we'll include this download for any of you that are interested in seeing this has been so eye-opening for me, and I've been in business 9 years. I'm like, do I need like 700 insurances now? But it's like, it's one of those things that, you've got to be informed, because there's all these pieces that can knock you out of business when it's that like just random thing that you didn't know about. And it doesn't matter. There's like no forgiveness if you didn't know about it. It's still the law, or it's still the rule, of how that works. So we'll include your links and how to contact you. We'll include the link to download this. Thank you so much for your time. This was so incredibly valuable, and I know it's going to help a lot of spa owners.
Hey, always a pleasure, Danielle. Happy to get back to the group. It's a great group you got, Dan.